Quick programming note before we get started. This is going to be the only video for today. Those of you guys who watch me every day, you already know that our high schooler is competing for the state championship right now in flag football. Her next playoff game is this afternoon. Once again, we're having to drive over 2 hours to go to this game, which is okay. But that is where I'm going to be later this afternoon. Won't be able to get a second video uploaded like we normally do. We will be back to our regular schedule tomorrow. All right. Let's get into Dawn Staley and ESPN. There are certain moments in our lifetime where we witness something catching lightning in a bottle. Now, these moments are extremely rare, might happen once every generation. When you stumble upon something like this, your overall value tends to be overinflated. For example, back in the late 90s, Vince McMahon, he stumbled upon two once-in-a-lifetime superstars, Stone Cold Steve Austin, The Rock. Historically, in the business of professional wrestling, wrestling promoters would have one top guy, one top draw. Ric Flair was the top draw in WCW, Hulk Hogan, top guy in the WWF. It is extremely rare for a wrestling promoter to have two massively over mainstream superstars at the same time. I don't know if it's happened in the business since Austin and Rock, but during their prime years, the WWF was setting record high ratings. If I remember correctly, there were 7, 8, maybe even 9 million people watching the WWF on USA Network on Monday nights. During that period of time, though, the overall value of the WWF was being falsely inflated. Eventually, their ratings would return to their historical averages, which is exactly what happened. During the early 2000s, ratings began to decline. Steve Austin begins to lose steam, eventually retires. Rock leaves WWF for Hollywood. Ratings for professional wrestling, or as they now call it, sports entertainment, they have never returned to the pinnacle they set in the late 90s. Vince McMahon, he stumbled upon a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity, but that did not mean that the WWF would remain in the mainstream forever. Last spring, we witnessed something else catch lightning in a bottle. Women's college basketball. The women set record ratings during their tournament. Well, KC, don't you mean March Madness? No. When I hear someone mention March Madness, I automatically know they are talking about the men. There is no such thing as March Madness in women's college basketball. Now, I know the mainstream media wants that to be the case. In the name of equity, we must call the women's tournament March Madness. But here on the channel, we don't believe in equity. Equity is a myth. But even with that being the case, the women, they performed extremely well in the ratings during their tournament last spring. Almost 10 million people watched their championship game. Records were broken in the Sweet 16 and the Elite 8, with both rounds eclipsing 1 million viewers. Longtime viewers of this channel, you guys know that I'm not a fan of women's basketball. And it has nothing to do with misogyny. It has everything to do with the fact that the product on the court is substandard when you compare it to the men. However, I thought the championship game last season was very entertaining. Like I said, the ladies, they performed well. Because of that, because of the record high ratings, the value of women's basketball is being overinflated. Recently, Dawn Staley, she was interviewed by something called The Boardroom. During the interview, they were talking about the potential value of women's college basketball. Now, the current broadcast deal for women's basketball with ESPN set to expire next summer, I believe in the month of August. Right now, ESPN's paying $40 million for the exclusive rights to all the women's postseason tournaments, all of them. Basketball, volleyball, I guess cheerleading, all the women's sports, they are being lumped together into one package deal. Why? Because historically, they've had no value. They don't generate ratings. But with the recent success of the women's tournament, the NCAA, they are selling women's college basketball separately from the other sports. Now, during this interview with The Boardroom, Dawn Staley, she blasted ESPN for not paying the women what she thinks they're worth. We need other networks to step in to show ESPN our worth. ESPN knows our value, but they don't have any competition from other networks. ESPN won't give us hundreds of millions of dollars if other networks aren't competing for us. Well, that's interesting. So much to unpack from that simple statement. I happen to agree with Dawn Staley. ESPN does know your worth. They know your value. Matter of fact, ESPN is telling you exactly what they think when it comes to your worth. When it comes to women's basketball, ESPN, they like to say all the right things. We are the exclusive home to the bearded beauties in the WNBA dump. ESPN is proud to be the exclusive home to unexciting women's college basketball. ESPN loves women until it's time for the passionate woke hug. In that case, we prefer the men. ESPN does an excellent job pretending they actually care about women's basketball. They are professionals at sending the virtue signals, but words are meaningless. Virtue signals are irrelevant. I don't listen to your words. I don't believe your flashy press releases. I look at your actions. ESPN's actions, they show us exactly what they think of women's basketball. Their actions show us what ESPN thinks women's basketball is worth. CBS owns the broadcast rights to the real March Madness. They broadcast the Final Four on a Saturday at the beginning of April, one game airing late in the afternoon, the other broadcast in prime time. Now, both of these are prime time slots, with both games being broadcast on network television, free TV. Championship game usually falls on the first or second Monday in April, and it is always broadcast in prime time. Why do you think CBS does this? Because they want the Final Four in the championship game to reach the widest audience possible. These are valuable time slots where advertisers are paying a premium. Now, let's compare how CBS treats the real March Madness to how ESPN treats the imposter. With the record-breaking success of the Final Four last year, you would think that ESPN would take advantage of that momentum, broadcast the Final Four on ABC. Nope. Women's Final Four, it's going to air in prime time on ESPN. But that's okay. There's just no way that ESPN won't broadcast the championship game in prime time on ABC, right? Wrong again. Women's championship game is going to air on a Sunday afternoon. Now, what does that tell you? What does this tell us about how ESPN views the value of women's college basketball? Tells me that ESPN thinks last year was a fluke. Dawn Staley claimed that it's up to other television networks to show ESPN what women's college basketball is worth. She also insinuated that it's the responsibility of ESPN to show the women what they're worth. That's not how this works. It's your responsibility to prove your own worth. It's your responsibility to determine your own value. Right now, the NBA, they are preparing to begin negotiations for their next broadcast deal with the television networks. Guess who is determining what the NBA is worth? Guess who is setting their value? It ain't ESPN, it's not TNT. Adam Silver, he has already stated on multiple occasions that the NBA is worth double, possibly even triple the amount they're currently being paid. Now, to her credit, Dawn Staley did set a vague value for the women's tournament. We are worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Yeah, that couldn't be further from the truth. According to Axios, the women's tournament, it is worth less than $100 million. Truth is, it's difficult to determine the true value of women's college basketball because they haven't set a level of sustained success. Just like the WWF in the late 90s, women's basketball, they stumbled upon two generational superstars, Caitlin Clark, Angel Reese. They are both entering their senior season, meaning this is their final year of being mainstream stars before they go to the place where careers go to die, the WNBA dump. If you remove them from the equation, is the championship game drawing 10 million viewers last year? Absolutely not. The only reason they set records last year, and these records, they were mainly set in the later rounds of the tournament, but the only reason that records were set last year was because of the overnight star power of Caitlin Clark and Angel Reese. If you don't believe me, go look at ratings for the first round of the tournament. First round of the women's tournament, they averaged 257,000 viewers. Now, to put that number in perspective, the WNBA, they average more than that during their regular season. And no one is watching the dump divers in the WNBA. Ratings for the second round of the women's tournament, 615,000. Now, that's a decent number, but it's not what I would call great. Women's basketball, they didn't start setting records until Caitlin Clark and Angel Reese emerged as superstars. Long term, that is not sustainable. Reality is, the product on the court, it's just not a draw. And that's not my opinion, it's what the ratings are telling us. During the regular season last year, women's basketball, they averaged 190,000 viewers on ESPN. Now, you tell me the network that is willing to pay hundreds of millions of dollars to average 190,000 viewers. Historically, ratings will increase during the women's tournament, but they're not increasing to the point where the tournament is worth hundreds of millions of dollars like Dawn Staley is claiming. Dawn Staley, she is essentially begging other television networks to compete with ESPN for their broadcast rights. So this morning, I did some digging. I wanted to know if there were other networks that were interested in bidding on women's college basketball. How many was I able to find? None. Now, to be fair, that does not mean there's not any interest. We're still several months away from a decision being made, but the NBA, they are 12, maybe even 18 months away from making their decision. And Adam Silver is fielding offers from multiple networks and multiple platforms. Obviously, there is a lot of interest in the NBA, but we will see. We will see if the women can match their rating success from last season. I'll be perfectly honest with you. I think they will perform well this season, both during the regular season and during the tournament. I think we could see a record-breaking season for women's college basketball, but what happens next year? What happens when Caitlin Clark and Angel Reese fade into obscurity in the WNBA? The men in college, they struggle to generate interest during the regular season. Why? Because they don't have any stars. Basketball has always been a sport that is heavily reliant on star power. There hasn't been a mainstream level star in men's basketball since Zion Williamson. Who was their big mainstream star before that? Hell if I know, that's how rare this is. We might not see a superstar in women's college basketball for another 20 years. The chances of us seeing two of them at the same time? Damn near impossible. What is going to happen with their ratings when they don't have the star power? We have decades of ratings data that tell us what happens. They fade into obscurity. But give me your thoughts here. Dawn Staley blasts ESPN for not valuing women's college basketball. Dawn Staley claims that the women's tournament is worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Do you agree? Do you think this level of success in women's college basketball is sustainable? What do you think is going to happen when Caitlin Clark and Angel Reese are forced to leave college? Can women's basketball maintain their success, or will they return to their historical averages? Let me know. Sound off in the comments below. Like, subscribe, share the video. I appreciate every one of you guys and your continued support. Best way to contact me is by email at btlkc84@gmail.com, KC_BTL84 on Twitter. I'll see you guys tomorrow.